Thanks everyone for coming out on this slushy, lovely night. I've done one event so far earlier than this, and it also was a slushy, lovely night. So maybe this is what I should expect going forward for things. It's appropriate, and I was talking to people about this today as I was thinking about the snow. It's appropriate that there's a little snow on the ground because snow, as it turned out, was a critical factor in the building of subways in this country. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but subways came to be in large part because of a storm, much bigger than the one we're experiencing today, and a much deadlier one. I thought what I would do tonight is a couple things. I thought I would talk briefly about the question everyone sort of asks me when they hear about the book, which is, how'd you come up with the idea for the book? It's sort of a natural question you often hear. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to read a few passages. One thing about this book is it sort of toggles back and forth between two great cities, Boston and New York. And that's interesting to talk about because, as we know, those two cities have a little bit of history together. A certain gentleman named Babe Ruth, sort of people tend to think is what started that rivalry. But in fact, it goes back much further than that. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So those two cities sort of have a lot in common and a lot of differences. So I'll do some readings from a few passages from the book that sort of give you a flavor of how the book covers Boston and New York, because they were very different projects. When Boston opened its subway, just to give you an example, it was essentially about a mile of track. It was a tiny little section of track. When New York opened its subway, it was essentially 20 miles of track. So it was a much, much bigger project when they opened. And of course, some people like to joke that Boston stopped building after they opened that 1 mile and sort of never improved upon the train. We're still riding on what they rode on back then. Whereas New York sort of certainly did expand and grow and sort of explode its subway system. So briefly, just sort of how the book came to be. When I first started, I used to be a transportation reporter in New Jersey. It was one of the beats I covered when I worked at a paper that's been getting a lot of attention lately, the Bergen Record. And when I covered transit, I was fascinated by trains and transportation issues. And when I moved up to Boston, sort of riding on the T was always a fun experience. And as I started looking for a book idea, and I started looking at the idea of the Boston subway, knowing that it was sort of the first subway in America, one of the things that was interesting is as I looked into the history of it, and I discovered that nobody had written sort of the true story behind how the subway came to be. But then I was really interested when I discovered that at the same time Boston was debating and building and digging the subway, New York was doing the exact same thing. At the same time, in the late 1800s, both cities were completely overrun by immigrants who had flooded into the city in the second half of the 19th century and had really sort of overrun the cities. And the cities were, at the time, sort of just fingernails of what they are today. Everybody was crammed into just a tiny portion of the city because that was as far out as you could go. If you wanted to go, just take Brookline, for example. If you wanted to get from downtown Boston to Brookline, it would take you 2 hours by horse, carriage. And so people out here, very few people lived out here, except for the extremely wealthy. And they had private carriages, and sort of that was the way life was back then. If you did not have a private carriage and a horse-pulled cart for yourself, then you lived downtown on one of those sort of streets where that was developed very early, and that was it. And the same thing was true for New York. In New York City, everybody lived in the furthest part of downtown New York City. It was just crammed into that fingernail of the island of Manhattan. And it was only when trolleys began to speed up and the electric trolley came along and other sort of means of moving people around started to come along that then people were able to move out of the city. So at first it was 1 mile, then it was 2 miles, then it was 4 miles, and eventually 6 miles and 7 miles. The city started to expand and grow. And that was critical to be able to get people further out from the downtown area where they were living. So that was sort of a big moment in the second half of the 19th century that happened, was the expansion of cities. The book sort of developed from that pivotal moment. When cities started to expand, what happened was a couple of pivotal moments happened. The blizzard of 1888. In 1888, a storm unlike nothing we've ever seen since then crippled the entire Northeast. For at least 400 people, but some people estimate more than 1,000 people were killed. in this blizzard. It just devastated the entire Northeast. New York, Boston, and everything in between ground to a standstill. When that happened, New York especially sort of took a look at the way they were moving their people in the city, which at the time was on elevated trains and on carriages on the streets, and said, you know, this has to change. We can't be at the mercy of the skies any longer. We have to change this. Boston at the time had already started to look at ways to move people underground. And this is where the story for me became very interesting. There was a gentleman in Boston by the name of Henry Whitney. So if you think of the name Whitney in American culture, for me anyway, two things come to mind. One of them is the Whitney Museum in New York City, which is obviously a famous, great museum. It was founded by ancestors of the Whitney family. Another one was Eli Whitney. I remember back sort of like in 5th grade, I don't know if that's what it was when I first heard the guy who invented the cotton gin, but Eli Whitney was a cousin of the Whitney family. So this family is just one of the most important cultural and families that made such an impact on American life today. These two brothers from the Whitney family who grew up in Conway, Massachusetts, sort of out by Springfield, they both played pivotal roles in their two subways, one in Boston, one in New York. Henry Whitney lived right here in Brookline, and he is essentially single-handedly responsible for what you see now on Beacon Street. He is the man who sort of saw the vision of Beacon Street becoming what it is today, with tracks down the middle, trees lining those tracks, boulevards on both sides of the street, of the tracks. And he sort of saw that and developed that and made a fortune off of it. He's also the man who first proposed the idea of building a subway, a tunnel, underneath Boston Common. That had never been done before. In 1887, he went before the state legislature and proposed what, for the time, was a radical idea. We should tunnel under Boston Common. The idea was met with jeers. A lot of people said the Common is sacred ground. We can't go there. Don't touch that. That's, you know, can't go anywhere near that. And he sort of pushed it, and he became a critical figure in how the subway came to be today. At the same time he was doing that, his brother, William Whitney, was getting involved in the street transit system in New York City. And the interesting thing about these two brothers is that they were polar opposites. Henry Whitney was a slacker, dropped out of school, bounced around the country, trying to find a direction, a job, didn't marry until he was in his 40s. And when he married a woman 20 years younger than him, and sort of just was directionless for a long time until he got involved in transit and real estate. And that sort of gave him a purpose and gave him a direction, and it focused him. His brother was the exact opposite. His brother married, first went to Harvard, went to Yale, married into one of the richest families in the country, the Payne family of Ohio, which had made a fortune in oil. And eventually William Whitney became an important lawyer in New York City who helped bring down Boss Tweed, and eventually was recruited to run for president. And had William Whitney wanted to become president of the United States, he could have been. In 1896, the Chicago Convention, there were buttons, people walking around saying, William Whitney for president. And he didn't want to be president. In fact, he came back home and gave an interview to the Globe at the time where he said, I'm not running for president. He was very emphatic about it. But he helped get Grover Cleveland elected president in the early, in the 1880s. And he became a huge political figure in Washington. He got involved in transit in New York. And the two brothers became these critical figures in this project. So to me, as I discovered that and I dove into the life of the Whitney family and the subway, I became sort of fascinated with it. I have these two cities, Boston and New York, these two brothers, Henry and William, and then this amazing project. And the last reason I wrote this book, and maybe in some ways the first reason I wrote this book, is I think that all of us tend to take these things for granted. We ride the subway, we ride these massive things. If you think about the Brooklyn Bridge, other projects over the centuries that have been built. When we ride the subway today, whether it's in Boston, New York, London, Paris, wherever you are, I think we tend to not think about how that tunnel came to be. And in Boston and in New York, that tunnel came to be because of immigrants, workers, Italians, Irish workers, came to this country with the sole purpose of digging a tunnel with picks and shovels and axes, their bare hands, horses pulling out cartloads of dirt. There were no giant, machines that we see today when we walk by a construction site. There was none of that back then. There were just men and their tools.